A supermarket customer is accosted in the parking lot by a stranger attempting to abduct her. In a tense standoff, she realizes the man has a more twisted plan. He claims she is his fiancée and knows intimate details of her life. Can the woman escape this well-orchestrated trap? Thank you for your subscription and likes. You can leave your comments in the comment area. I'm a part-time worker. I make a living working for a security company. I'm on their books as an agency worker, so it's not really steady work. But I do well enough not to complain. On the night that this happened, I was sent out to work overnight for a company I hadn't worked for before. I didn't love the sound of the gig, and I could admit now that I was a little reluctant to go, but I did. I set off that evening to spend the night working the night shift. I arrived at the address and I found my way to the company. It was basically a massive warehouse. My job that night was to guard the warehouse. I was a little surprised that they hired a security guard to do this gig, because all I had to do was make sure that no one broke in. It seemed that they were really worried about theft. I guess it kinda made sense then. You don't really want an old guy with nothing more than a flashlight torch guarding the place from thieves, I guess. Well, my evening got a little easier. I thought to myself as I was shown around. I was told that all I had to do was visit some checkpoints regularly at the designated times, and when I wasn't doing that, I was free to do as I pleased, even take a nap. I was fine with that arrangement. I brought along my laptop and I had plenty of interesting material to watch on that while no one was around, even some top shelf stuff if you get me. I thought I was all set to have a fun and carefree night, but that changed at around 1:00 a.m. because that was when something strange happened. I wasn't new to strange going on. I'm a security guard. After all, I got some other stories, but most of them can be explained logically. What I mean is I'm kind of used to the things that go bump in the night. Creaks and bangs don't really make me jump. So when I heard something more than the usual noises I would hear, I realized that something was different about this place. It wasn't just a noise, though, it was an atmosphere. Here I felt cold. All of a sudden I even started shaking. It was so cold, and it was supposed to be summer. I spotted a thick jacket in the restroom earlier that night and I went to retrieve it. I guess it belonged to someone who worked here. That sudden cold snap was weird, but I warmed up a little with the jacket on. I decided to start one of my patrols a couple of minutes earlier than scheduled. I figured walking around would keep me warm. There were security cameras set up in that warehouse, and I knew that someone from my firm got fired for slacking off because one of the clients reviewed the security footage and found out he didn't do anything on the night he was supposed to be working. So I had to do my rounds. I got moving. I left the break room and I went through this office area into the warehouse. I got a few steps into the warehouse and then it felt as if my heart was about to stop in my chest, because I sensed something. If you want to laugh at me for that, you can go ahead and laugh at me. But I was so completely petrified by this feeling that I had. I didn't see a ghost or anything like that. I was just so frightened by something unseen, like an atmosphere and whatever could be in the dark of that warehouse. It was the first time in my life that I had ever felt something like that. I'm not the type to pick up any paranormal or spiritual vibes from a place, but that night I had a feeling that I wasn't alone. I had my flashlight with me and I headed to the door at the back of the warehouse. There, next to these great big warehouse doors, was a smaller tradesman's entrance. I had to open a shutter and head in through it to continue my rounds. I saw the light of my flashlight shaking across the walls and the floor as I scanned around the warehouse. I made a determined effort to keep my arms still, so I pointed the flashlight at the wall and I focused on a spot. I was pleased that I did the whole M over matter thing. I resumed scanning the light over the warehouse but stopped. The only issue was the fact that the torchlight still looked like it was shaking. Light and shadow were dancing together. Was there something there? It looked like some kind of shape, something that was solid that was moving in the depths of the warehouse. There was something there. To my own surprise, I began to follow the light of my torch. I was terrified, and that was the first time in my life that I realized that when people are truly frightened by something, they don't panic. On the contrary, they just remain calm, extremely calm. I was able to think clearly and rationally. No matter how I looked at it, I felt like I was doomed to content that night, even though I was a little cautious. I knew that if I didn't finish my job, then I wouldn't get paid, and it was as simple as that, and I probably wouldn't be looked on all that favorably by my boss, the person who gives. Without the jobs, I'd probably get given something terrible for my next job as some kind of punishment. So with those thoughts in mind, I continued. I saw something in the darkness of the warehouse, and it was my job to go in search of it. So that's exactly what I did. I was praying that it was just a cat or something that kind of size, but I didn't know. I tried to get a hold of myself. My mind was racing. I tried my best to push all the unpleasant, intrusive thoughts to the back of my mind as I headed to the back of the warehouse, the location where I saw that shadowy shape. I didn't know how it happened, but I managed to lose track of that shadow. I didn't like that. I had to know where it went. It crossed my mind at that point that it could be an intruder and not just something paranormal or a trick of the lights, but I had a strong feeling. It wasn't though either way. I went further and further into the darkness of the warehouse, ignoring the patrol route. Momentarily, I was shining my torch all over, and I think I caught another few glimpses of that shadow up ahead, so I followed. All I had to do was stay calm and do my job, a job that I've done time and time again. It was just another job. That's what I was telling myself before long. I found myself turning and heading down a passageway with no exit. At the other end of it, I had just walked myself down at dead end. If something came for me while I was there, I would have no place to run or hide. I wanted to light up the whole place, but it was too dark, and the flashlight didn't cover enough area for me to do that. I felt the sweat slowly spilling down my temples and my forehead. I was half bracing myself to be attacked and half preparing myself to attack. If something got me here, then I knew deep down it would be the end of me. I had to hold it together. I began to scream something. I didn't really notice that I had started so much for that being ultra calm theory, I guess. Look, I'm on patrol here. I don't want any trouble. You don't want any trouble from me. Okay, I said words to that effect, thinking back on it. That kind of makes me laugh. To be honest, I must have sounded mad anyway. Getting back on topic, something unbelievable happened next. I was staring at the back wall in the dead-end part of the warehouse, and that's when I got a look at this thing for the first time properly. It seemed just to come out of the floor, the wall, or maybe even the dark itself. It was a tall, slim, human-like shadow, and it loomed there in the back of the passageway like a predator ready to pounce. In a matter of seconds, I was no longer alone. I felt like this thing really wanted me to get out. I got the strongest feeling of "you're not supposed to be here" I've ever felt in my life. I slowly backed away and backed out the way I came, and as soon as I was out of that passageway, I turned 180 and ran for it. I ran back through the little office to the safety of the break room, and I immediately turned on my laptop. When 3:00 a.m. came around, I couldn't physically bring myself back down there to do another round, let alone fumble around with the doors and set the aligns if I wanted to leave. I didn't care if I got fired. I was not walking around down there with that shadow person thing. I valued my life way more than my job. I ended up skipping that 3:00 a.m. patrol as well as the 5:00 a.m. one, and I watched Gentleman's Material on my laptop all night. I couldn't think of anything else that could so easily distract me from the fear of what I had seen down there in the warehouse. I watched the same flick again and again like an idiot just to distract myself. I just waited for the morning to come, and as soon as it hit 7:00 a.m. I was out of there. 7 a.m. came and went, and so did I. I imagined that I would be getting a complaint or even called into the manager's office and give him my marching orders. I spent weeks dreading that phone call would come, but it never did. No complaints were lodged and I kept my job. It's kind of weird. I mean, why wouldn't they complain about a guy who didn't do the job, who just sat there all night watching blue movies instead? I don't know. Seems a little suspicious on their part, right? Well, I have a way I'll never work in that warehouse again, that's for sure. I ended up asking a couple of colleagues if they had ever patrolled the warehouse, and some said that they had. I asked them if they had any experiences similar to mine while on a job, and to my surprise everyone said that nothing happened when they worked there. 5 security guard, no issues on any of their shifts. That's kind of strange to me. In the end, I got a reputation of being a scaredy cat who watches blue movies at work. Yeah, they all thought I was a creep, and it wasn't long after that I decided to leave. I guess don't tell your work colleagues too much is the lesson here. Bit of a strange ending, but I think I encountered some kind of entity when I was down there in the warehouse. This happened when I was working part-time at a ramen restaurant. I first got that job when I was around 16 years old during my early years as a high school student. This happened in my hometown Koda in Shiga Prefecture. The ramen restaurant that I worked in was inside a shopping department. I worked nearly every weekday after school, serving customers and operating the register. I would start at about 700 and work right up to midnight on some nights, cleaning and closing down, usually opposite the register. There was a row of seats for anyone in the mall to use who needed to have a break. They were used by everyone, not just customers of our restaurant. My experience happened about a year and a half into working there, making me a 17-year-old. Also, I'm a female. On one of my shifts, my manager and my coworker both approached me during a lull in the shift and asked me the following: "Hey Erica, do you have any older friends around here?" Of course, I was a bit confused by their question, but I quickly responded with no. I didn't want to be asked their weird questions like that. My manager and my coworker were both kind of shocked, and they shook their heads in what disagreement or surprise. I wasn't sure at the time, and then my manager said, "I see, I didn't know why they asked me such a question. I didn't know what they were talking about." I got back to work and I kind of shook it off. Few weeks went by. My coworker came up to me again and said, "Hey Erica, can you please go to the bathroom and come back?" Okay, this was weird. I stood there confused, and then the manager came over. I asked both of them why, but neither of them gave me a proper answer. The manager just replied with, "It's fine, it's just an experiment. Could you please go back and forth real quick?" I did as I was asked, and I went back and forth from them in the bathroom. I didn't understand what the point of this so-called experiment would be, though after going to the bathroom, standing there for a couple of seconds and coming back, I saw looks of concern over my coworker and manager's faces. My manager then frowned and said, "I think you might be being followed by an older man." I couldn't really understand what they meant. I guess that was because I was young and a little naive. I couldn't really process what older man would have any interest in following me and why. So I asked them. The pair of them then made a subtle glance across to the row of seats, and then I looked in that direction. I saw an older man sat there on the seats looking our way, but as soon as he saw me looking in his direction, he turned his head. I had no idea who that guy was. I felt a little creeped out by him, though he was certainly looking my way. I asked my co-workers why they thought he was following me. I mean, sitting outside of the restaurant. Is that being followed? I didn't know the rules, so I let them explain. Every time you're on shift, that guy sits right over there and he looks at you. When you leave work or get up and go to the restaurant he gets up too and he starts following you. Seems to us like he's stalking. It scared the heck out of me. Not like a ghost story or horror film did, though, as they say, people are way scarier. I looked over at him again. I wanted to make sure that I was sure that I didn't know him. I studied his face and I was certain that to me he was a stranger. I felt really weird inside when I realized that, kind of disgusted. Or just kind of numb and cold. After they told me that he had been watching me, I couldn't get it out of my mind. While I worked, I spent my shift either looking over my shoulder or looking straight at him. I would make casual glances in an attempt not to make eye contact with him. When I left for home that night, the guys made sure they walked with me part of the way. But later, when I was alone, I looked over my shoulder and I saw that creepy middle-aged goo following me from a distance. I realized in that moment that I was being stalked. I got home, but my God, it was nervy. I didn't know if that guy just happened to walk home the same way that I went. I only realized a little later that I couldn't really just go on what my co-workers' theories were. I mean, they were hardly detectives. I didn't really want to, but I just had to give the man who gave me the creeps the benefit of the doubt. However, my thoughts changed when I went back to work the following night because the creepy man was back. It was more than a coincidence. I went to the bathroom and I noticed that he was stood kind of close to the bathroom while I was in there. Then later on my break, I needed to go to a nearby convenience store. When I left, I realized that he was following on behind me. He watched me go in and then, to my surprise, he left thinking positively. I was kind of glad of being away from that guy, so I headed back to the restaurant. I saw a familiar figure sat on the seats opposite my work there. He watched me return to the store. He never took his eyes off me. I asked my co-workers and manager to keep an eye out for that creep over the coming days. I was still unaware of what I should do. Chillingly, I heard from one of my colleagues that my new stalker was seen going into the same convenience store as me right after I had left, and apparently he bought the exact same things as me. He was taking an interest in all the magazines I had picked up and flipped through. It was all piling up on me. It felt like he was there from the moment I started my shift until the moment I finished it. I didn't know what I could accuse him of, though, and how much trouble it would bring me if I did accuse him and it wasn't taken seriously. I was so creeped out by him at that point I began to resent going to work to the job that I really enjoyed. I was beginning to feel frightened more and more regularly. My manager, I guess, picked up on how anxious that man made me, and he went to the security guard with a complaint about him. The security guard went over to the creepy guy and made a big scene and embarrassed him and then moved him on. It wasn't anything like, "Hey, you creep." It was something more subtle like, "Excuse me, can you explain what you're doing?" It worked, and it worked fast because in a matter of moments he was gone. He quick walked away from the rower seats while his face turned red. I was relieved, but my relief was short-lived because the very next day that man was back and he was up to his old tricks. He was watching me and following me again. My manager was really angry that man was back, and he stormed straight over to the security guard of our department store and told him to give the creepy a strong message he's not to return, and if he tries to come back, then we will be filing a police report. The security guard went right on over to the creep who was sat on the seats opposite our restaurant, and he gave him that warning. Once again, creepy guy got up and stormed out as if he had been embarrassed. I hoped he would learn the second time round. I guessed that the threat of the police report might have done the job. We all felt confident that the weirdo wouldn't be back again, and for the first time in a long while. It was quite an enjoyable shift for me. I was able to work with peace of mind until closing time. I can't tell you how nice it was to glance up from the register and see nothing but vacant seats opposite me. With everything closed down for the evening, it was time to head home, and little did I know, but my journey home that night was going to be quite memorable. I headed to the underground parking lot to get my bicycle. It was always dark down there, especially when I got off the late night shift. I unlocked my bike and I hopped on. I went to push off to get going, but for some reason my bike didn't move. I tried to push off again and nothing happened. I didn't know what was wrong with my bike. I really didn't need this. On top of all that was going on at work, I turned to see if my back wheel was caught on something, and that was the moment I faced my stalker eye to eye. He was stood there with both hands wrapped tightly around my back tire. He was preventing me from leaving. It was terrifying because it seemed as if he literally had stepped out of the shadows. I had no idea that he was in the underground parking lot with me. I was so scared that I couldn't make a sound. I tried to push off again, but it was a bit weaker this time, and I tried to scream, but nothing would come out. Nothing would work. It was at that point that I realized he was muttering something he was saying. Why something like that? I don't know why, but something just kind of changed in me at that point, like a switch that needed to be flipped. I exchanged my fear for anger. In a matter of seconds, I turned around and I yelled at him, "What do you think you're doing? Let go of my bike." I didn't expect him to come back at me with the following, "Why did you say that you were going to the police? What on earth are you thinking?" His words really creeped me out, like beyond how he had been behaving up until that point. I think it was because they were just so one-sided. It was all about him and not the trouble he had been causing me. "Look, I'm scared, you creep me out, please let go of me." I said that next. Well, maybe shouted is more accurate. I knew that embarrassment seemed to work on this guy, so I tried to make him feel embarrassed. He came back at me with a louder voice, shouting at me, "I never put my hands on you. Are you kidding me? You gonna call the cops just because I looked at you? Well, good luck again." This did nothing but highlight how selfish and horrible this guy was. He didn't care how he was affecting me. He was just interested in himself. Fortunately, our heated exchange of words had alerted the mole security guard to come rushing over. As soon as that creep noticed that security was coming his way, he bolted. He ran off with his tail tucked between his legs. After that encounter, my boss demanded police patrols to make sure that if that guy showed up again, he would be met with the police. Even though cops were walking about the mall, I couldn't help but think that he would show up at any moment. While I was working, I began to get super anxious when anyone would look my way for more than a second or two. I was growing more and more paranoid by the day I had to leave that job. In the end, I got into a university hundreds of miles away. I'm glad I left, to be honest, but before that creep came along, even though the hour sucked some nights, that was probably one of the best jobs I ever had. One thing I still have trouble getting over all these years is the fact that he was angry at me for wanting to report his disgusting behavior. I saw a glimpse of his solipsistic world, a man with no ikes or empathy. A man who said this to a 17-year-old female who was scared and tired of being stalked by him. He said, "I never put my hands on you. Are you kidding me? Are you going to go to the cops? All because I looked at you. Good luck." He knew what he was doing. He knew when to leave when security came. He knew he had to hide when the police presence was in the mall, and he knew how to try to gaslight and to try to manipulate me into believing that I was going to be in the wrong for reporting him. All I could say is that I'm very grateful for all the dudes that helped me through that issue. If it wasn't for those guys, then I don't know. One night, not too long ago, I was reminded of the scariest thing that has ever happened to me, and I thought that I would share it here. So here it goes. I was shopping at my local supermarket, and as I was walking across the parking lot back to my car carrying shopping bags, I suddenly felt my arm being tugged from behind. I turned around expecting to see someone I knew, but I came face to face with a complete stranger. At first glance, he looked to be a normal-looking guy who was in his mid to late 20s. I naturally assumed that he had mistook me from someone else, but he said, "Hey, wrong car, mine's over here, come on." I thought, what the hell are you doing? Was this some kind of prank or something? I said nothing. I just stood there shocked, but then he started pulling on my arm harder and harder, and he began to guide me towards the direction. He said his car was in. "Hey," I snapped at him. "Hey, you got the wrong person," I said as I tried to shake free of his grip. He looked at me square in the eyes and said, "There's no mistake here. Come on, we're going home." When he looked at me like that in the eye, I realized that I was dealing with a very dangerous person. I felt a shiver run up my spine. I began to panic because he began to pull me harder and harder. I tried to scream out, but because I was so overwhelmed with fear and shock, I could barely make a sound as I was being dragged. All I could think about was how it would be all over for me if I got in that man's car. I was prepared to put up a fight, but I could already tell that this guy was too strong for me. He was fit and I'm not exactly unfit, but I am a woman. Fortunately for me though, I wouldn't have to plan too long for how I would fight him, because an elderly man who was parked near my car was returning back to his car. He could see that what was happening wasn't normal. He shouted out to me and asked if I was okay. I screamed for help and the man shouted for security as he tried his best to rush over to help. I guess that he was in his 70s by the look of him. I didn't want him to get hurt if this guy who had me by the arm lashed out at his involvement. The security guard came rushing over and this dude was big. He grabbed the young guy who had a hold of me and he made him let go. I was asked by a store worker if I was okay, and if I would give a statement to the store so that they could ban him or pass it on to the police. This happened simultaneously. The young guy who grabbed me was taken to a room at the back of the store and held to be interrogated until the police arrived. Apparently the young guy said that this was all a misunderstanding and that I was his fiancée. He said that I'm a bit of an overreactor and that there was no problem at all. He was pleading with the security guard on the night shift to let him go back to allow him to return to his fiancée. He was telling the security guard about how worried I would be about him being detained back there. He was so convincing that the security guard came out from the back and asked me if any of that was true. Of course it wasn't. So, I told him that. I told him that I'd never met this weirdo before in my life. I was asked if I was sure and if we weren't just in the middle of some kind of argument, and that really made my blood boil. But I guess now I understand how convincing that guy must have sounded. I showed the security guard my ring and photos of my husband and my children. The security guard then went back to speak to the guy. And the next time he came out he told me something very disturbing. The weirdo was rumbled by the photos I had shown and decided to confess. The man who grabbed me knew that I was married and knew that I had children. He knew that I regularly went to this supermarket on the weekends and he thought that meant that I had a falling out with my husband, so he thought he could swoop in there and marry me. I know that sounds so strange, but stay with me until the end and all will be revealed in the end. He was taken away by the police and he stuck with the theory of his. A little while after this, his parents arrived from their countryside home to apologize to me. I guess this is a very Japanese thing. If you aren't used to, it might sound strange, but we do stuff like this. After meeting with his parents at the police station, I explained the situation to them and I told them about what had happened. They asked if I would allow their son to make an apology to me, and I was fine with that. I kind of wanted more answers. If I'm being honest, I explained to their son about how happy I was with my husband, and even though he works long hours, I knew he was doing it all for our family. When I told him that it was like he had been exorcised, he turned completely sane and rational, like he had been rid of some kind of possession. It was the strangest thing I'd ever seen. I really don't know why I did that to you. I'm so sorry for making you feel so scared. Even though I'm a bit naive, I decided to give him the benefit of the doubt. I didn't know if he was being sincere or not. I ended up receiving some compensation money from his family. I actually decided to keep in touch with his parents. They weren't to blame for their son's frightening choices. That night they told me that they had been worried about him for a while now. They had noticed some changes in his behavior that they deemed strange. They decided to take him for a checkup at the doctor's, who in turn referred him to the hospital. After an X-mic they discovered that he had a brain tumor. It happened a long time ago, and a couple of years or so after that encounter with the man in the supermarket car park, I ran into one of his acquaintances. A few people came up to me after it all went down to hear the gossip, and this is how I knew this guy. Since I bumped into a friend of his, I took the opportunity to see if I could find out how he was doing, and apparently the surgery went well and he was now living abroad. I don't hate him. He was clearly not in control of what was going on in his body or his mind. All I can say is that it was a real eye-opener. This incident taught me that a tumor could change a person's personality attitudes and turn them into something that they aren't. I used to work for a security company in Sendai. It was a pretty good job. If I'm being honest, the day mic wasn't to be sniffed at. It was pretty perfect for what I needed at the time and I liked the job. But if I'm sharing my story here, you know it's not all going to be smooth sailing, right? I want to tell you about the incident that made me decide to quit. After about a year on my security company's books, I was given more and more work. Some jobs were really great, but some were not so great. My last assignment, the one that made me quit, was a road construction job. The construction company had site offices that I had to patrol. Basically, I had to go up and down a stretch of the highway from Shiroshi to Yamagata as I drove to meet my colleagues and to take over the night shift. I was told by one of the security guards that he had enough of working there, and he didn't want to come back for any amount of money. I thought at the time, wow, must be something going on. He mentioned something about it being haunted, and then I was like, oh okay, fine. I wasn't all that worried, so I clocked in, not giving it much mind. But then later that night, or maybe I should say that morning, at about 4:00 a.m., I heard a voice coming through the radio. It wasn't a ghost or anything weird. It was just one of the guys who worked for our security firm on the night shift with me. Hey Ken, I'm seeing someone. Oh geez, I really hope you can see this man, because otherwise I think I'm losing it. There. Someone stood on the surface of the lake, directly in the middle of that lake. Man, verification please, over. There was a lake that was nearby the construction workers' offices, so I looked in that direction. I'm not really a lover of pranks, if I'm being honest. So I was expecting to be irritated by whatever he was trying to spring on me, but I looked nonetheless. Since that was my job. I don't see anything, man, over. I replied through my radio. There's a person on the lake and they're walking. Now it looks like they're headed your way, over, coming my way. Had this guy lost his mind? He came rushing over to where I was. He was absolutely shajanto his core. I didn't see anything, but clearly this guy did it. It had him really worked up. I've seen people frightened before, but this was another level. The look of fear on his face made me want to leave my post, so we all did. For a brief period. We called the other security guard to see if he had heard or seen anything, and we all met up. The other security guard said he had seen a woman wearing white clothes earlier that night by the lake. Apparently I later found out that this location was famously home to a spirit. I looked it up online. I don't know if that's what my friend saw, but legend says that a woman was staying in that hotel near the lake and her life was touched very violently, and her used remains were cast to the bottom of the lake, and they call her the Lady of the Lake. Like I say, I didn't see her and I don't want to see her. I don't want to see anything that could make a man be as scared as my colleague was that night, so that's why I quit. Some things just really open your eyes. A long time ago I had a job at my local convenience store. It was only a part-time gig and I was grateful of the money it brought in. Since I was new to work at that age, one thing that I wasn't keen on was the fact that I worked the night shift. It wasn't my first job, and don't think that I was too young, because I wasn't. I was old enough. I think I was about 21, and I'm a guy, if that matters at all. This incident happened one night during one of the colder months when I was cleaning. It was after 3:00 a.m. I know that because that was the time I had to empty out the olden containers and clean them. These containers were usually pretty oily by the time you had to empty them out, so he had to, put some elbow grease into cleaning them. It wasn't a 5-minute job. I knew I would be in the back of the store for a little while. The convenience store policy was to wash these when it was quiet, which was about 3:00 a.m. for me. So I was in the back carefully washing these containers, careful not to splash myself with any of that stinky oil. To be honest, I thought that I heard someone come into the store, so naturally I shouted out, "Welcome." I turned to face the door. I was facing the sink at the time and I was kind of surprised to see that there was no one there. I didn't overthink it because you know these things happen. I just put it down to the fact that I must have been half asleep or something, so I went back to washing up the containers. I kept scrubbing for a while, but then I noticed something from the corner of my eye. I looked up through this window we had in the back and I saw a woman with long black hair stood by the magazine rack. I guess that someone did come in then. I was aware of her and I would react should she approach the counter, but more often than not, people who had right for the magazine rack are there to browse for a while. Well, in my experience at least, I finished cleaning the olden trays and I set them out to dry. I figured that I might as well put some water in the kettle if she wanted to have a cup ramen or something else. I hung out in the back, busying myself as much as I could, but she didn't show any signs of coming to the register. I stuck my head out from the back and I looked for the black-haired customer who entered my store, but I came up empty. There was no one in the store but me. It seemed okay. This was weird. I decided that it would be a good idea to look for her, just to make sure she hadn't collapsed or something worse. I went up and down the aisles but she was nowhere to be seen. I even gave the lady's door a knock before opening. It was showing us vacant, and opening the door proved that it was vacant. I thought okay, whatever. And I started back towards the register. I must have been more tired than I realized. As I looked up, I saw the woman with the black hair stood in the back, just behind the window. I saw her from earlier. I froze. I had just done a sweep of the store. I had checked all the places that she could have been, and for her to be back there without me knowing seemed an absolute impossibility. I panicked. It was impossible. That word just kept coming back to me. I ran to the first safe place I could think of, which was our warehouse store area. It was good that I did that because in our storage area there are these surveillance cameras which covers all angles of the store. I stared at the 4 camera angle feeds for the longest time, but I couldn't see where that woman went. I knew that I had seen a woman in that store, though I couldn't trick myself into doubting what my eyes had seen. I couldn't do anything about the situation I was in, and the eyes I believed had seen that woman were now telling me that the store was empty. So I timidly returned to the store. I still had a job to do. I wasn't going back there. Empty-handed, though. I carried a mop with me. Your head. It's lame and I didn't want to use it as a weapon. I had no intention of hurting anyone that night. I just didn't want to be without something. If it was just a customer and I was just overreacting, then I was just going to have a perfectly friendly mop-up in the store. I made it back to the cash register. It was somewhat comforting to have the barrier of the counter between me and whatever might be here. I realized quite quickly that I needed to occupy my mind, so I began to count the bills in the register, and when I got bored of that, I went over to the magazine corner. I decided to borrow a magazine of my own, a men's magazine. I was 21. Come on, reading that made me feel a little better about what was happening. I calmed myself a little. I was engrossed in my gentleman's reading, but then I heard a truck approaching. It was the garbage truck, so I quickly went out to the back to grab all the rubbish we had, and then I returned to the front of the store for the second time. That night I froze in place. I saw someone's feet in front of me. They were head height. I couldn't help but stare at these feet that seemed to be suspended in the air right before my eyes. The ankles were facing me. I slowly looked upwards. The dangling feet belonged to a woman with long black hair. She was softly swaying left to right. She had something around her neck that extended to the ceiling. In a matter of nanoseconds I understood the situation. I saw a woman suspended from a rope by her neck. My eyes showed me her pale face and hers gave me a bloodshot glare. She wasn't there. She couldn't be there, yet she was there. Feeling as if my work had turned into a haunted house, I ran for it. I guess I ran out screaming because I only stopped screaming when I was aware of the fact that I was screaming. Worse than the screaming was the fact that I couldn't control my arms. They were just uncontrollably shaking. I couldn't pull my phone out of my pocket at first, but when I did, I made what I knew would be a very embarrassing call to the police. I was out of options. I knew that what I was about to tell them would be strange, but I didn't know what to do. After a while, a couple of officers arrived and I spoke with them outside because I wasn't going back in there alone. They initially had looks of concern on their faces, but when I explained the situation, I saw their expressions change. They went into the store and looked over the place while I waited outside, pacing up and down, peering in when I thought that they weren't looking my way. The 2 officers had a conversation in my store that I couldn't hear, and then one of them came back outside to speak to me. "Hey kid, are you sure you didn't imagine it? Maybe working alone reminded you of a horror film or something like that. He then gave me a smile and said, yeah, that's it, isn't. It was as if saying that was the kind of case closed moment for them. To be honest, I didn't argue. I didn't think that they would ever see what I saw, and I didn't like the way they spoke to me. So I was glad to see the back of them when they left. I didn't mind at all, but I made sure I stood by the door for the remainder of my shift. If anything else weird was going to happen, I was going to make sure that I was out of that door as soon as possible. I got through the night, and when I saw my manager next, I told him that I didn't want to work the night shift anymore. Thankfully, I got a switch to an earlier shift, and that was my last night shift in that convenience store. I could never do it again after seeing what I saw. Just the thought of seeing that woman suspended in the middle of the store gives me the chills. I dreaded work, but I needed the money. My town wasn't known for the opportunities that it gave our youth. I couldn't stop thinking about what I saw, and I eventually realized that I wanted to find out more. I looked into the building's history, and when that came back with nothing, I looked into what other buildings were built on that plot of land. It wasn't long before I discovered that a block of apartments stood here before the convenience store did. I looked up the address on Oromateru, and I found something. There was an incident of someone taking their own life in this building. Hi Jay, here I've covered this one before. All. Shimaru is a website that essentially gives you a map of previous incidents that have occurred in areas. Japanese people use it to see if a place is haunted or to find out reasons why a place gives off a bad vibe, for example. If you want to know more about this, I go into a bit more depth in another video that I will link in the description. It's my accident property video. Anyway, back to the story. Did I see something that night? Did I see a woman who ended it all? I don't know, but I know I saw something. There were times after that night, even on the morning shift, that I thought I caught a glimpse of that woman through the window when I was in the back. I had to leave that job. I'm glad I did, but I'm just worried that I'll see that woman again someday. I hope her spirit can find peace and rest before I ever see her here again. For